Live from Mexico City, this is The Morning Break with Graham Stanley, and you are listening live.
Hello and welcome to The Morning Break. I was supposed to have a guest lined up for today, but it fell through. So I'm taking Tom Rogers' advice, and I'll be talking about my EdTech life. I'll be looking at my top 5 tech experiences and how they've shaped my experience as a teacher. So I'll be speaking about these memorable learning points or experiences I've had related to technology and education.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org or join in the conversation by downloading the Podbean app and following Teachers Talk Radio. #TT Radio.
Technology, love it or hate it, these days you can't ignore it. Prior to becoming a teacher, I've been wondering when preparing for this show, what were the key moments for me as far as technology is concerned. And I think definitely one of the first things that I remember is the arrival of a colour TV at home, which was a very big deal. And one of the things I remember first seeing when that colour TV arrived was the Harlem Globetrotters playing basketball, and just the vivid colours of their what they were wearing, etc. It was just amazing. And so that was the first real sort of, if I'm trying to pinpoint when technology really made an impact on my life, I think that was definitely one of them. The other thing that definitely comes to mind is the calculator. The first time I actually got a calculator that was necessary for me for school, and that was fascinating. Actually, having in my hand a piece of technology that would help me with schoolwork. That's probably my first experience of educational technology, definitely, but as a student. And I think all of the talk that has been going on about some of the things that are available to students today, such as ChatGPT, all of the AI tools that are going to really transform everybody's life. Well, if I think back to the calculator and the debate about the calculator and how parents and teachers were very concerned that it would lead to lead to problems with students not being able to use maths in the way that they should do, and how that is just sort of looking back. I think it seems a bit ridiculous, really, that was felt to be the case at the time. Next on my list of moments for when technology sort of certainly had an impact on my life prior to being a teacher and without really thinking about education is definitely my experience of the first computer games. And I remember seeing the first computer games console in the house of an uncle of mine, Uncle Jimmy, and he had a console that just played Pong. So that very simple black and white screen where you have the game of electronic tennis going on with two sort of squares, one either side of the screen, and that square ball being battered from one to the other. And that was so exciting to see, which sounds ridiculous now, but the idea of being able to play a computer game like that in the house was fascinating. So that was definitely a kind of eye-opening moment for me as far as technology is concerned. We never had one at home, but I used to look forward to going to my uncle Jimmy's house, and he'd get out the Pong machine and plug it into his TV, and we'd play, and that was amazing. So there's that. Then I guess Video game arcades were a very important part of my life as a young teenager, and going to the coast where I grew up in the northeast of England and playing Space Invaders and others of these games. That was an important moment for me where you'd get together with friends and cluster around some of these stand-up arcade games and play them. And then, apart from the classic Pac-Man, which I never really liked because I was never good at it, I was always more into the space games like Galaga and Space Invaders. So apart from that, I think one of the exciting things was on a regular basis just going and watching other people play rather than, so it wasn't even about playing the games myself, which is quite interesting because of the things that are happening at the moment with uh, a lot of young people in particular watching people play video games on YouTube and channels on Twitch, etc. And there being this sort of fascination with being sort of spectator video games as a spectator sport. Well, it's not really new actually. I always felt that whenever I saw people commenting upon the idea um, of teenagers today actually watching gamers play and it being a little strange to a lot of people. Well, I remember going and watching players play down at the arcades, but they were playing live, of course, not on TV. So I didn't find it that strange. And I remember one game in particular caught the attention of me and friends, which was a game called Dig Dug, which was a game where you actually had to dig down um, and collect things that were hidden under the earth, such as gems, etc., and building tunnels and avoiding the monsters that were coming after you. That was fascinating, and we used to go and play that a lot. And I think that was a game that we used to play a lot because it wasn't too difficult to play, and you could actually play for quite a long time with just the one coin that you put in. A lot of the other games, you would end up playing for a few minutes and then you'd be killed, and it seemed like you were uh, wasting your money because it didn't last long. So I think that was one of the reasons why we played Dig Dug. Next on the list, I think, has to be IBM PCs. And so when I first started working after university, um, I worked in a company in architectural practice that had on the desk IBM PCs. And these were the first, or one of the first, personal computers. They stood on everybody's desk. They were monochrome screens that were black with very piercing green light or orange light occasionally. And I definitely think the reason why I'm wearing glasses today was because I had a few years actually working every single day with those IBM PCs. And everyone who worked with them ended up getting glasses after about 6 months. And that is definitely the time when I started having problems with my eyesight. So I look back and I think, yeah, I think that was probably the reason for it. So working with IBM PCs was definitely a pivotal moment for me. That's when I first started getting my taste for computers and what they could do. And a lot of it was record keeping that I was involved with at the time, straight after university. So because it was an architectural practice, sort of keeping a database tracking the architectural drawings, etc. So record management. And then that led me to getting my first home PC, which was an Amstrad. And I remember actually very concerned about the amount of money that was costing me to actually buy one of those. but being very excited about getting one. And again, it was black and white screen, I think, and it was a very basic computer compared to the computers that we use nowadays. But it was very exciting to actually have a personal computer at home, and I made full use of that for all sorts of things, including computer games. And then I think just before I left the UK to go to Spain to work as an English teacher, I remember at work someone telling me about the internet and bulletin boards, etc. And that was my first sort of taste of hearing about what that could do. And this person I worked with called Ian, I remember him saying, "You would really love this. You would love this. I wish I could show you it." I'm not sure how he had access to it, but he definitely had access to it through a friend. Otherwise, he would have readily and happily shown me it as well. I didn't really get to see it, but I heard about it back then when it first started appearing. And those, I think, were the times when I started that I had access to, or that when technology really had an impact on my life prior to becoming a teacher. And during the rest of the show, I'll talk about technology and education. So I'll be talking about some of the key moments that I've had when it comes to education, teaching, and technology, and some of the learning points for me as a teacher and in the classroom. And so be sure to stay tuned if you think that's of interest, and feel free, if you're out there and listening live and would like to talk to me about your relationship with education and technology, then I'd love to hear from you and call in. But right now, though, let's take a quick break and listen to the Teachers Talk news.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, a leading publisher of books, directories, educational guides and magazines specifically aimed at forward-thinking schools in the UK and beyond. Have you checked out their latest releases? Don't miss out! Visit johncattbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles and advance your own professional development today. Happy reading!
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
At the National Higher Education Conference, Unison Assistant General Secretary John Richards opened proceedings with a damning critique of the government's approach towards university education, according to Unison's own website. Mr. Richards focused on out-of-touch ministers who fail to understand the current funding crisis, and pointed out that the funding models across the UK seem to be broken. He cited the issue of limited government funding as causing a de facto cap on student numbers, and accused the government of trashing the UK's reputation for higher education in Europe, leading to big drops in the numbers of overseas students. A story covered by Teachers Talk Radio News last week. Mr. Richards went on to assert that those in government do not understand the cost of living crisis because they've never had to face it. Strike action by those working in the HE sector has been part of a wave of action taken by unions across a range of public sectors in recent weeks. The last week saw the release of details of government plans to revamp children's social care in England. BBC News reported on the plan for more early support for families and the extra £200 million funding for the next 2 years. Last year, a review warned that tens of thousands more children could end up in care without additional funding and reform. The plan has faced criticism that many of the changes are being rolled out as localised pilots rather than a national programme. The government plans to put families at the heart of the reform, and intends to provide better support for all vulnerable children in order to reduce the need for crisis intervention. There will be pilots in 12 local authorities which will deliver more early support for families struggling with addiction, domestic abuse and poor mental health. There will also be more family-type placement for children in care with relatives, friends or foster families. Other changes include plans to recruit more foster carers, a simpler process and more support for relatives or friends who take on children, a rise in the leaving care allowance, and support for councils to recruit and retain more social workers. Economic, Constitutional and Social Policy Forum Politeia has published an article focusing on its views of the proposed changes to the school's history curriculum. The publication History, Whose History? The Battle for the School Curriculum features 3 historians' views on the proposals. The government's plan for reform came in response to recommendations from the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities. The plan for a new model history curriculum for pupils to see themselves as integral parts of what makes up the UK today was proposed. The essays included in the publication focus in on the responses of a variety of academics who all appear to conclude that there is no need for the proposed changes, because diversity is already built in the current programme. Further details of the publication and forum for debate can be found on the Politeia website. Finally, a school principal in a rural part of Northern Ireland has expressed concerns over safety after it emerged that recruitment of lollipop men and women is being frozen. It comes as part of a drive to save money. The current power-sharing deadlock in Stormont meant no budget could be agreed and significant cuts needed to be made. The principal of a rural primary school, Donna Winters, told the BBC that until recently there had been consistent crossing patrol staff that have been vital in making sure pupils can cross roads safely, but that they have not had staff since December. The school has had to resort to employing a patrol staff member directly and, when they are absent, teaching and support staff have to fill in. Ms Winters went on to point out that safety was not an area where cuts should be made. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with Joe Fox.
This is 2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
Hello, it's Safer Internet Week, with the official day being on the 7th of February. This year, the UK Safer Internet Centre focuses on Want to Talk About It, making space for conversation online. They've got loads of educational resources on the website saferinternet.org.uk, banded into 3 to 7, 7 to 11, 11 to 14 and 14 to 18 years of age. They are even translated into Welsh and have adapted resources for SEND and ALD. So, they have pretty much covered all bases. You need to take a look. But why do we need to get our young people talking about this? Well, let me try and give you an idea in one breath. With an estimated 5.16 billion people using the internet, that's 64.4% of the world's population. It's estimated at around 500,000 predators pose a threat to young people daily, with the main target being 12 to 15-year-old children. With a quick search of statistics from the internet, I found supposedly 1 in 25 children will be manipulated in some way this year, and 80% of predatory behaviour will be through social media. This coupled with only 15% of parents actually knowing what their children are doing online makes this an issue which definitely needs to be talked about with our young people. To get some perspective on this, every 60 seconds TikTok users watch over 167 million videos. Data never sleeps. We need to know how to stay safe because the sheer volume of data means it cannot effectively be policed. Please send your thoughts amongst the 575,000 other posts every 60 seconds on Twitter at TT Radio Official. I'm Steve Woods, and that was 2 Minute Tech.
2 Minute Tech with Steve Woods, your tech briefing on Teachers Talk Radio.
So, back to my experience of educational technology. Well, I think the next real moment, or the first real moment of being a teacher and coming across education technology and understanding what it would mean, was when I was in my first year as a teacher, and I worked in a small language academy in a place called Terrassa, which is very near Barcelona in Catalonia, in northern Spain. And I remember in the staff room of this academy, one of the teachers had brought in an Apple Mac computer, and it was just sitting in the corner. we weren't allowed to use it. It was his personal computer. He decided to bring it into to the school to use, and I'm not quite sure whether he left it there or whether he took it home in the evening, but it was definitely there during the day for some time. And I remember he was trying to experiment with what that computer could do. So one of the things he used to do was create worksheets. And I remember one day in particular where I was teaching adults English in the evening, and he prepared a worksheet based on an incident that had just happened with the Prime Minister to be, Jose Maria Aznar, where someone had put a bomb under his car and had tried to kill him. And there was a news article, I think, I'm not sure which site, would have been CNN, etc., one of those news sites, and this teacher had created a gap fill about the activity. So he had it available, he printed it off, I photocopied it, I took it up to class, and I was able to use it with my students and surprise them, because they had no idea that this incident had happened, because they'd been at work during the day, and then they arrived to take their English class, and the first time they heard about this was actually through my worksheet. And that felt to me that it was a very powerful thing that we were able to do with that. Take current affairs and bring text into the classroom to interest the students. We ended up having a very stimulating conversation around all of this, touching on everything from politics to terrorism, etc. And I felt the students, when they were talking to me or trying to talk to me, because I think they were quite low level, were really engaged and trying their best to communicate their ideas. And this, for me, was what it was all about. So that was my big aha moment as far as using the internet in the classroom. It's like, you can use it to get students engaged in material that is so up to date that wasn't possible beforehand. I think nowadays it's taken for granted that we can just do that, and with access to news and the internet on our phones, we're unlikely to be able to engage our students just with that type of information. Of course, we have to work a lot harder, but back then it was really something quite special. So I think that was an important thing that really made me understand and want to explore more the use of the internet in the classroom. And that led me to develop in all sorts of different ways as a teacher. I remember going to a summer school where I had access to the internet on a computer, and I was one of the few teachers who was interested in using it. And because of that, the director of the summer school actually allowed me to use it a lot more than the other teachers who weren't particularly that interested in it, and I made use of it for worksheets, etc. But then at that point, I'd started becoming fascinated with the idea of websites and the fact that you can actually build your own websites. I taught myself a little bit of HTML to be able to do that, and I offered the owner of the summer school the chance of me building them a little website. So I took that on as a project during the actual summer school and built a little website for him and for his school, which was my first sort of experience of trying to write to program websites, etc. And that was fascinating as well. And I think related to the internet in general, the other thing I would say was coming back from that experience of having used the internet during the summer and to be able to have some experience of HTML, etc. That gave me the opportunity at work to have access to the internet in my school, and again, I was the internet then was very limited. We only had access as teachers if you didn't have your own computer, which was unlikely as a teacher back then you would only really have access to it through your school, and there would only be like one computer for use with the school. And I remember in Barcelona, again, having access to the school's computer and being given the responsibility to find resources on the internet that would be of use for students, and for other teachers to use, and creating worksheets. That led me to actually get a part-time position in what was the internet classroom. So in International House in Barcelona, back in the day of the first sort of stirring of the internet, the Academy International House actually set up an internet classroom, and that was made available for students to come and use whenever they wanted, whenever there weren't classes, etc., to be able to use as an internet cafe. And we also, the people who worked in that internet classroom, actually created worksheets for teachers to use with their students. And I was one of those people who was fortunate enough to be able to do that. And so we had the opportunity. I had the opportunity when teachers came and brought their students in for 20 minutes, half an hour, for example, to the internet classroom. We had ready-made worksheets with activities available, and I was co-teaching, if you like, with the teacher who brought their students in who didn't know much about the internet, and would take over the class really to be able to give them that experience. And that was really my first experience of working with students and other teachers in a computer room, really, with live internet access and activities. That again was fascinating and really did lead me to understand the value and the potential of that kind of activity and educational technology. I also think it's quite interesting, the two people I worked with who really, it was their idea to set up the internet classroom, Gavin Dudney and Dee Taylor, I think it was. They both ended up writing books for teachers with two different publishers during that period. So the first books, as far as I think it was not the first actual book about the internet and English language teaching, but certainly the two books that came after that, and one of the most popular ones, were written by the two teachers I was working with in that Barcelona classroom, which is quite interesting, I think. So that was a real experience, I think, a real aha moment for me, as far as educational technology is concerned. And by this time, I was hooked on being able to use the internet with students, and educational technology in general. I thought it was fascinating, and was something that at the time was really starting to affect everybody's lives. And of course, we had no idea just how much technology would have an effect on all aspects of life back then. But certainly it was something that was perceived that it would definitely become more important. My next key moment, as far as educational technology is concerned, is the weblog. And blogging, I think, entered my world at the year 2003, in July 2003. So this year it'll be 20 years since I've used blogs as a teacher and with students. And this was something that was quite interesting because back then in 2003, the British Council, who I worked for then in Barcelona again, they had one of the first learning management systems. They just launched it. It was a global learning management system. It was available for all teachers and all students in theory, and it had lots of potential as far as chatting is concerned, as far as being able to publish. And this seemed to be fascinating. And I was teaching teenagers and pre-teenagers during a summer course at the time in Barcelona, and I'd applied for use of this learning management system, which was called Global Village back then. And it was way before its time. It was the first time I'd ever heard of anything like it and being used for students. And that, was something that I applied to be able to use. And there were so many permission forms that were necessary to be able to get access to it, that every single child I had to collect permission forms from their parents, of course, quite rightly, I think. Although these were early days, and I think we hadn't really understood much about this type of safeguarding that is so apparent to us now, I think. But back then, I definitely had to collect permission forms from the students, from their parents, and then I needed to submit them to my director of studies, and my director of studies needed to submit them to somebody else, and then they had to review them and give me access. In the end, it just became so bureaucratic that I gave up on it. So it was such a process of trying to get access, filling in papers and waiting to be able to get access for my students to this learning management system, that it became impossible. And so, unfortunately, the potential of Global Village, and I can see my former colleague Chris Fry, who's based in Barcelona, he remembers this. The potential was so interesting, but the reality of actually trying to get it to work was another matter. Unfortunately, it wasn't used as much as it could have been because of all of the bureaucracy involved, and the kind of worry, I think, about how it could be misused meant it wasn't used as much as teachers or learners would have liked to do it, unfortunately. All that is to say that what happened was I had booked the computer room at the place where I was working to use with students during the course. I had this idea, and I'd actually told the students that we were going to be using computers as an integral part of the course, but then I didn't have access to what the learning management system. So I decided to follow up on something that a friend of mine had told me about, which was a blog. So he'd actually introduced me to this idea of a blog through Blogger, one of the first popular blogging platforms, and I set one up. And ended up using that with students. But while I was using a blog with students and getting them to write and to publish, and again, having permission from their parents to do this, but without having to go through the other layers of bureaucracy to get access to it, because I could just do it myself, was interesting. So I started using this, and it was quite successful. Or at least I thought so at the time. Looking back at it now, I'm not sure how successful it was or how useful or interesting it was to the students. They were certainly interested in it because it was new, and I'm sure that it did help them with their writing. But after the course had ended, I started experimenting in the rest of that summer that I wasn't working with blogging and trying to find out who else was blogging as far as English language teaching was concerned. That's when I came across Teresa Almeida Deca, and she had a weblog with her students, and her students were very young, so she was doing all of the actual publishing. They weren't actually they didn't really have access to the weblog themselves, and so she was publishing their writing on it. But definitely, she was using it as a way of sharing content online, so that they would be engaged enough to write. So the idea of having an audience beyond the teacher to write is what the blog gives students, I think. This is the real benefit of blogging. The idea of being able to share your work, your writing, your thoughts with people, which included at that time with their students, their parents, was really interesting. And I'm looking now at a post that I wrote back on July the 30th, 2003, which was my first sort of reasonable length post for teachers on a blog that I set up called blog-efl.blogspot.com. And it's really nice having still that all of those posts as a memory of what happened there, because I certainly wouldn't remember exactly when it was, etc., if it wasn't for that. And I was posting about Teresa's blog with students, and this idea of having a class blog. And I did a little review of that, and I was fascinated with it. And through Teresa, I got to know about other bloggers at the time, other English language teaching bloggers, and it was just really a very small group of people who were doing this. One of them was someone in Japan called Aaron Campbell, and Aaron had actually written a paper about blogging, and it was he who started defining what types of blogs you could use with students. So it was like a student blog, which was when each of the students would have a blog, a class blog, which would be one blog for each of for all of the students in a class, and a teacher blog. And I realized that what I was doing with the blog that I'd set up at that time was a teacher blog, and that's what I continued. And I continued writing this teacher blog for quite a long time, giving it up and going back to it, but it still exists, and I keep meaning to go back to that as well, because I did really enjoy blogging, and I felt reflecting on teaching and educational technology, which is what I used this blog for, was something that really helped my development, really. So it's something I think I might want to try and go back to use again. I think the idea of the blog sort of died off with social media, with Facebook in particular. It's like people started writing their thoughts, etc., on Facebook. And one of the things that meant it wasn't very popular anymore was the fact that people got out of the habit of leaving Facebook and going to another place to actually comment upon them. So when the comments dried up in the comment on the posts in blogs, then people lost interest, really, I think, in blogging. Although I do think that there are still people who do it very effectively. Okay, so that was the one of the first experiences I had with educational technology that really made an impact. And I developed blogs with students after that, and really felt this idea of instant publishing and sharing student work to a larger audience really did have an effect on their learning. This idea of being able to to share with a wider world. I think it was very important, sort of breaking down the walls of the classroom and being able um, to share. I think one of the things I think was quite interesting is that with writing, it was very difficult to get students to actually revise their work before submitting it. But if they felt that their work was going to be seen by more people beyond the teacher, then it was a lot easier. So you could convince students to actually revise it. You could do the corrections and get them to revise the work so that they would feel a lot happier knowing that there weren't any errors when it was being published. That was blogging. I think the next thing that really had an impact on me, grew out of blogging, was, I remember when it first appeared, this idea of audio blogging. And I won't talk much about this because I talked a little bit about this in the show that I had a few weeks ago with Japan's first blogger, Scott Lockman. But definitely podcasting was this idea of being able to blog using audio files. So it was called audio blogging as well as podcasting back then, and being able to share your thoughts, but actually with speaking and listening became a very important thing. And of course, with language teaching and learning, the idea of being able to share audio was a very revolutionary idea. And definitely that became an important thing for me. So as I went on and was teaching university students at the time who were studying tourism, I came up with this idea of a course which was called theme tourism. And for that course, we looked at different themes within tourism, so how themes could be used to actually teach. And this was an English course, but it was an ESP course, so English for Special Purposes, if you like. So the idea was that I was to teach English to these students at the university who were studying tourism, but also have an element of related to tourism in the English classes. And what I came up with was a course which looked at different case studies, if you like, of tourism in different countries and how those themes were used to attract tourists to the country. And that included, for example, the idea of Robin Hood. So how Robin Hood is used in the UK to attract students to attract tourists to the UK, the whole legend of Robin Hood, and how there are, curiously enough, several places where he was supposed to have been born, several places where his body was supposed to have been buried, etc. All sorts of things, and the battle between different counties as far as the legend's concerned, with Sherwood Forest, which used to be a lot larger than it is now, etc. What I did with students and podcasting was I asked them to prepare a short 5 minutes or so report on a theme of their choosing. And I gave them the opportunity of submitting the script and for me to correct it and to give them ideas of how to make it better before they did this. But then they would record it and we would podcast that text. And so the finished product, if you like, for their project was a 5-minute audio text of them that they would prepare based on a report that was around a theme, and we had this as a blog. That was quite an interesting thing to do, and I did that over several years. So that was podcasting and how that became an important part of how I used education technology with students. And again, it was, I think, a very interesting thing for me to be able to see how you could help students develop their oral skills to become much better at speaking through asking them to do this, and they would have to really focus upon producing something that was going to be heard by potentially an audience that could include anyone in the world. Although the reality was that there weren't that many people listening in, but it was the idea that they needed to do that and make it to be decent enough, and that they would be proud about what they say. And I could also listen to their finished work and give them tips on pronunciation, etc. And then they would re-record it before it was published. So the idea of going back and getting it right, of getting it better, was an important thing when it comes to podcasting. So that's podcasting. Moving on, we've got a couple more of these aha moments, or these learning points for me as far as educational technology and my use of interaction with it is concerned. The next one was definitely games and virtual worlds. So again, last week's show was all about gamification, and I have spoken in the past. I've done a special on game-based learning as well, so I won't talk much about this. But I had been playing games, as I mentioned right at the introduction, from an early age, and I'd always played computer games. I think when I became a teacher, I'd not had access to a computer when I left the UK and moved to Spain. So for a while, I was not a games player, but then I started playing again once I had a PC again, and I started becoming interested in the idea of perhaps playing games with students or using computer games with students. And the reason for that was, in particular back then, the preteens, I think in particular, was a group that were fascinated with computer games, in particular the kind of mini games, the flash games that were appearing at the time that were free to play. And that was something I thought was fascinating. The idea of taking a game, and a lot of these games were, if you like, they required information to be able to solve puzzles. So the idea of a lot of these point and click games, or indeed the escape the room game genre as it started appearing back then, were the ideal games to play with the students, because they were quite difficult puzzles, and in order to solve the puzzles and move on in the game, you needed to either spend quite a lot of time experimenting, looking for hidden objects, etc., clicking on the screen, or trying to figure out puzzles that were presented to you, or what a lot of players did back then once they got stuck was they used to look on the internet for what was called a walkthrough. And now I think most walkthroughs are video walkthroughs, so you can actually watch a player and how they move through a game. But back then they were all written, and they were all written in English. And so that discovery, I think, and it was me and a colleague of mine back at the place where I was working, Kyle Moore was the colleague, that we were both becoming separately, but we ended up sharing a lot of ideas together about the use of these games and how they could be adapted for students. So we ended up doing a lot of worksheets, sharing ideas and of how to use the games, and using the walkthroughs became fascinating, because with the walkthrough you had a script where you could actually tell the students in English the solution to the games that they were playing. So we used to take the students into the computer room to play a particular game, after 30 seconds to a minute or so of them playing, you would say, okay, here's how you get past or here's how you get out of the first room. And I remember one game in particular doing this, and all we did was play the first screen of about, 20 screens of this game. And it was all with them all being so attentive, listening to me, and then acting on my instructions to be able to complete the first screen of this game. And it was a fascinating listening activity for me. I realized that you got instant feedback because the students who could not get out of the room or could not move, it's because they didn't understand what you said. So you could go and give them some extra tuition at the screen. But then I think the aha moment for me was really at the end of that class, when we finished and we'd only played one screen of the game, and the student said, how do I play this afterwards? So I gave them a link to the game, and but they also said, but what if we get stuck? And so what I did was I actually photocopied the rest of the instructions from the walkthrough, the written instructions in English of how they could finish the whole of the game. Not for all of the class, but for about half of them who were interested in it, and gave them photocopies of this. So they had 15 pages of English, which was all about, which was the walkthrough of the game of how they could actually finish the game on their own. And they took that away. And I remember them coming back into the next class, and I asked them about this. Did you play the game? I said, yeah, we played it. We loved it. If you've got any more games like that, if you've got any more sort of suggestions, then please let us know. And I was like, well, how did you manage to finish? He said, oh, we used your instructions. And that was like the big aha moment. It was like, okay, I couldn't get these students to read English for homework, more than a page, and it wouldn't be something they would do. But as it was a game, they would happily go away and take 15 pages of English and work through it and actually read it to be able to allow them to complete the game. That was a massive aha moment for me, and that led to definitely me and my colleague Kyle understanding that this idea of using games with students was a massive thing. That led to us writing a book together, and that was over 10 years ago. So that was the other big aha moment. I realize I am running out of time now, and so I'm going to finish off by, I'm going to skip the virtual worlds aspects, because that was the other big moment for me when I started using Second Life, which is one of the first really interesting virtual worlds to come available for teaching and learning. And again, I'll leave that for another day. And I'm going to jump, just for the remaining time, which is very little, to talk a little bit about video conferencing. So when I left Barcelona and went to Uruguay to work, I started working on a big video conferencing project with primary students. And I realized at that point, just the power of video conferencing was amazing. That ended up taking up quite a few years of my life. That was about 10 years ago now. And the idea of being able to connect students who are not with teachers or with other students who are not physically present in the room, and how you can actually teach online effectively, became something that I became fascinated with. And it was obviously something that became a lot more important during the pandemic for all of us. But quite luckily, if you like, I had a lot of experience of being able to observe teachers teaching from different locations and seeing how they could do it more effectively, and being able to give advice for teachers through those observations, etc., on a big project where we taught thousands of students. in Uruguay from places such as the UK, Argentina, the Philippines, Colombia, and Mexico. That was fascinating. And that was really quite an eye-opener for me as far as the potential of video conferencing to be able to connect people together. And I think we've all understood that because of the pandemic. And that is something that is so still very interesting for me, the idea of being able to putting people together who are not physically present, the idea of being able to teach wherever you are, if you have access to a computer and a webcam, etc. And one of the things that we were able to show through that project that I worked on was the idea of student achievement not being affected at all through them being taught remotely. So there was a study where the students that were being taught face to face were given the same tests as the students who were taught remotely, and the results showed that there was no difference in attainment. That was quite a moment for me, because back then, about 7 years ago, 8 years ago, there was this sort of doubt about the effectiveness of remote teaching, about teaching through video conferencing and whether it would be as good as. Of course, I think there isn't any doubt in my mind and in a lot of other people's minds, and certainly the feedback we got from students is that they much enjoyed, they had a better experience if they have a teacher in the classroom. They preferred that. But as far as attainment is concerned, there was no difference that we were able to ascertain through the testing that we did. So again, that was a big moment for me as far as educational technology is concerned, the idea that you can actually make the experience and the effectiveness of teaching and learning to be similar if you try hard to do it. And that brings me to the end of today's show. Thank you to Tom for suggesting I do this. I was about to cancel the class because the guest fell through, but I thought, okay, this would be an interesting challenge for me to do. And many thanks to all of you who've listened in live, and especially to those of you who have made it to the end of the show, and to those of you who are listening back to the recording as well. And remember, there are Teachers Talk radio shows all week, so please tune in and listen to the variety of teachers sharing their experiences and talking to guests. Hopefully the next time you will listen to me, it will be with a guest. Bye for now.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.